Welcome to Café Tales. I'm Alie, your host for today's mystery. Today we find ourselves in 1937, Nice, where Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings encountered deadly secrets behind the elegant facade of the Hotel Splendid in Murder in the Lavender Salon. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Pour yourself a glass of something fine, keep your wits about you, and let's step into the mystery. Murder in the Lavender Salon, Chapter 1. The final curtain. Mediterranean sun was setting behind the palm trees of the Promenade des Anglais when I arrived at the Hotel Splendid on that fateful evening of March 15, 1937. I had come to Nice for what I had hoped would be a restful holiday. Orders, you understand, but fate, it seemed, had other plans in store. I was rather surprised to find Poirot already established in the hotel's most prestigious suite, his patent leather shoes gleaming as he sat in the elegant lobby, fastidiously adjusting his tie while perusing the evening's program for the hotel's private salon performance. "Mon ami Hastings," he exclaimed, rising with that peculiar precision of movement that characterized all his actions. "But how delightful! Though I confess, I'm not entirely surprised to see you. The little grey cells, they suggested that you might find your way to Nice at precisely this moment." "Poirot," I said, clasping his hand warmly, "what brings you to the Riviera? Surely not just the spring weather?" His eyes twinkled with that familiar gleam of professional interest. "Ah, but there is to be a most magnificent performance this evening, Madame Céleste Valois. Perhaps you have heard of her. She gives her farewell performance the last time, sadly, that the world will hear that glorious voice in public." I had indeed heard of Céleste Valois. The French soprano had captivated European audiences for nearly 2 decades. Her voice described by critics as liquid silk touched with fire. Her retirement at the height of her powers had been the subject of considerable speculation in the musical press. "A remarkable woman," Poirot continued, straightening an already perfectly straight cuffling. "But there are curious circumstances surrounding her departure from the stage. Most curious indeed." Before I could inquire further, a commotion erupted from the direction of the hotel's private wing. A woman's scream, high, piercing, and filled with genuine terror, shattered the genteel atmosphere of the lobby. Poirot was on his feet instantly, his small figure moving with surprising speed toward the source of the disturbance. I followed close behind as we made our way through a maze of corridors lined with expensive tapestries and fresh flowers. The scream had come from the Lavender Salon, a private sitting room that the hotel reserved for its most distinguished guests. The door stood open, and I could see a small crowd gathering in the doorway. "Excusez-moi, s'il vous plaît," Poirot said firmly, using his elbows with remarkable effectiveness to push through the assembled guests. I heard mutterings in French, German, and English as we pressed forward. The scene that greeted us was one I shall never forget. Mademoiselle Céleste Valois sat slumped forward at an ornate vanity table, her magnificent dark hair cascading across scattered cosmetics and sheet music. She wore an exquisite gown of deep burgundy silk, obviously prepared for her evening performance, but her face was turned away from us, resting against the mirror's surface. The most striking aspect of the scene, however, was not the tragic figure of the great soprano, but the overwhelming scent that filled the room, a heavy, almost suffocating fragrance of lavender that seemed to emanate from every surface. On the white Italian marble floor beside the vanity lay the shattered remains of what had once been an elegant perfume bottle, its crystal fragments catching the light from the ornate chandelier above. "Mon Dieu," whispered a woman behind us. I turned to see a striking blonde in an expensive evening gown, her face pale with shock. "Is she?" "I'm afraid so, Madame," came a voice from near the vanity. A thin, nervously looking man in hotel livery was wringing his hands. "The doctor has been summoned," but he spread his hands helplessly. Poirot had moved closer to the body, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. I watched him examine the position of the woman's hands, the arrangement of objects on the vanity, and particularly the pattern of the broken glass on the floor. His nostrils dilated slightly as he tested the air. "Most interesting," he murmured, producing a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. "Hastings, observe, if you please, the position of these fragments." I looked where he indicated, but could see nothing particularly significant about the scattered glass. It appeared that the bottle had simply fallen and broken. Tragic accident during what might have been the great singer's final moments. "The police, they have been notified." Poirot inquired of the hotel manager, who had appeared at the doorway, looking thoroughly distressed. "Oui, Monsieur Poirot. Inspector Giraud will arrive presently. But surely this is simply a terrible accident. The poor mademoiselle, perhaps she felt unwell, reached for her perfume, and—" He gestured helplessly at the scene. Poirot's moustaches twitched almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps, Monsieur Dubois, perhaps. But tell me who discovered the body." "The maid, Marie," the manager replied. "She came to inform mademoiselle that her accompanist had arrived for the final rehearsal. When she received no response to her knocking, she used her key and found—" He could not finish the sentence. I noticed that several of the hotel guests were now gathered in the doorway, their faces bearing expressions of shock, curiosity, and, in some cases, what appeared to be carefully controlled emotion. A distinguished gentleman with graying temples stood beside a woman whose diamonds caught the light as she dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Near them, a younger woman in simpler dress watched the proceedings with an intensity that seemed somehow inappropriate to the circumstances. Poirot had completed his initial examination and was now standing perfectly still, his egg-shaped head tilted slightly to one side as if listening to some sound only he could hear. The heavy scent of lavender continued to pervade the room, and I found myself wondering why it seemed so unnaturally concentrated. The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of the local authorities, and I saw Poirot's face assume that expression of polite resignation he always wore when forced to deal with official incompetence. Inspector Giraud, whom I remembered from a previous case, entered with his usual air of bustling self-importance. As the inspector began his preliminary examination, I caught Poirot's eye and saw there that familiar glint of professional interest, mixed with something else, a certain satisfaction, perhaps, at finding himself once again confronted with a puzzle worthy of his talents. The Lavender Salon had indeed witnessed its final performance, but I suspected that the drama was far from over. Chapter 2. The company of admirers. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows of the Hotel Splendid's main drawing room cast long shadows across the assembled guests, each of whom, it seemed, had found reasons to linger over their breakfast, rather than venture out into the brilliant night sunshine. I observed that the tragic events of the previous evening had created an atmosphere of subdued tension that even the cheerful Mediterranean light could not dispel. Poirot had risen early, as was his custom, and I found him in the smaller morning room, methodically buttering a croissant, while studying a list he had compiled in his neat, precise handwriting. His little grey cells, I suspected, had been working throughout the night. "Ah, mon ami," he said, looking up as I joined him at the breakfast table. "I trust you slept well." "Why, I confess that sleep eluded me," I admitted. "There are too many questions, and the answers they dance just beyond the reach of understanding." "Questions about poor Mademoiselle Valois?" I inquired, helping myself to coffee from the silver service. "But come, we must speak with these people, while the shock still loosens the tongue. Grief and fear, they make people most communicative." Our first interview was with Baron Wilhelm von Stalfen, whom we found on the hotel's terrace, apparently absorbed in reading a German newspaper. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with steel-grey hair and the sort of rigid posture that suggested military training. When Poirot approached, the Baron folded his paper with movements that were almost mechanical in their precision. "Herr Baron Poirot," began with a slight bow. "Permit me to introduce myself, Poirot, and my friend Captain Hastings. We are assisting the police with their inquiries into last evening's tragic events." The Baron's pale blue eyes showed no emotion. "A most unfortunate accident," he said in accented but precise English. "The poor woman was clearly unwell." "You knew Mademoiselle Valois well?" Poirot inquired, settling himself carefully into a wicker chair. "We had met in Vienna some years ago. I attended several of her performances." The Baron's fingers drummed once against the newspaper, then stopped abruptly. "She was a remarkable artist." I noticed that he consulted his pocket watch twice during our brief conversation, and, when Poirot asked about his movements the previous evening, his account was delivered with the sort of rehearsed precision that made me wonder if he had been practicing it. "I retired early," he stated. "The mountain air does not agree with me as it once did. I was in my room by 9. Our next encounter was with the young woman I had noticed watching the scene so intently the night before. Marguerite Dubois proved to be Mademoiselle Valois' understudy, a petite brunette with intelligent dark eyes and calloused fingertips that spoke of countless hours at the piano. We found her in the music room, staring at the sheet music that had been prepared for the evening's cancelled performance. Her shoulders shook slightly, though whether from grief or some other emotion, I could not determine. Mademoiselle Poirot said gently, "We are deeply sorry for your loss." She turned toward us, and I saw that her eyes were red, but dry she was. "She was everything I hoped to become," she said quietly. "And now, you will have other opportunities," Poirot observed, his tone carefully neutral. Marguerite's laugh was bitter. "You think I wanted this? That I would wish for her death simply to advance my own career?" She gestured sharply at the music solist was going to help me. She had promised, but now, it is too late. "Help you how, mademoiselle?" Poirot leaned forward slightly, his manner encouraging confidences. "There are complications in the musical world, people who would prevent young artists from advancing." Celeste understood these difficulties. She glanced around nervously. "But I cannot say more. It would not be safe." The Countess Elena Rossetti was quite a different proposition altogether. We discovered her in the hotel's elegant conservatory, seated among the exotic plants and marble statuary, wearing a flowing dress of midnight blue that complemented her dramatic dark beauty. Her fingers, I noticed, were adorned with several magnificent rings, and she carried herself with the unconscious authority that comes only from generations of aristocratic breeding. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, extending a graceful hand, "your reputation precedes you, though I confess I had hoped never to require your services." Madame la Comtesse Poirot replied, executing a formal bow. "We are investigating the circumstances surrounding the death of Mademoiselle Val. I understand you were acquainted with the lady." The Countess's composure faltered almost imperceptibly. "We were friends, close friends." Her losses she paused, seeming to gather herself. "Forgive me, it is most difficult." "You visited her yesterday evening?" Poirot asked gently, "to wish her well for the performance." The Countess's hands twisted in her lap. She seemed in excellent spirits. "We discussed personal matters." "And the nature of these personal matters?" Poirot inquired. A shadow crossed the Countess's elegant features. "Private concerns, Monsieur Poirot, surely not relevant to this terrible accident." Our final interview of the morning was with Mr. Theodore Armitage and his wife, Vivian, wealthy collectors, who had come to Nice specifically to hear Madame Céleste Valois's farewell performance. They received us in their opulent suite, surrounded by what appeared to be a traveling exhibition of valuable artifacts. Mr. Armitage was a portly gentleman with the soft hands of someone who had never performed manual labor, while his wife was a sharp-featured woman whose eyes seemed to catalogue and appraise everything they fell upon. "Terrible business," Mr. Armitage declared, settling his considerable bulk into an overstuffed chair. "We were so looking forward to the performance, paid quite handsomely for the privilege, I might add." The woman was clearly unstable. Mrs. Armitage interjected with surprising vehemence, "All that dramatic nonsense about farewell performances, no doubt she was taking some sort of medication that affected her judgment." "You had met Mademoiselle Valois before?" Poirot inquired. "Once or twice," Mr. Armitage replied vaguely, "at various social functions. My wife collects musical memorabilia, you understand." Mrs. Armitage's laugh was sharp. "I collect valuable items, Theodore. There is a difference, and that woman's possessions will no doubt be quite sought after now." "How remarkably prescient of you, madame," Poirot murmured, his tone so mild that Mrs. Armitage seemed uncertain whether she had been complimented or criticized. As we took our leave, I could not help but notice that Mrs. Armitage was already making notes in a small leather book, her pen moving with the rapid efficiency of someone conducting an inventory. The hotel manager, Monsieur Dubois, intercepted us as we made our way back toward the main staircase. He was a nervous, deferential man who seemed perpetually worried about the hotel's reputation. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, wringing his hands, "I do hope these interviews are not disturbing our other guests. The Hotel Splendid has always prided itself on discretion and tranquility." "Monsieur Dubois," Poirot replied soothingly, "we conduct ourselves with the utmost consideration. Tell me, how long had Mademoiselle Valois been a guest at your establishment?" "Nearly a month," the manager replied. She had taken the Lavender suite for an extended stay while preparing for what was to be her final performance. Such a tragedy, and so unexpected. She seemed in good health during her stay. She was perhaps more reclusive than usual. These past weeks, Monsieur Dubois hesitated. She received fewer visitors, took her meals in her room more frequently, The staff noticed she seemed, how do you say, preoccupied. And yesterday in unusual occurrences, she had several visitors throughout the day. The Countess, as she mentioned, the young Mademoiselle Dubois, came for their usual rehearsal and, he paused, looking uncomfortable. Yes, Poirot prompted gently. The Baron von Stauffen requested to see her, though she had previously declined his calls. Yesterday she agreed to receive him. They spoke privately for perhaps 20 minutes. This was interesting information that the Baron had failed to mention during our interview. I saw Poirot make a mental note, his eyes sharpening with interest, as we left the manager to his duties. I found myself reflecting on the morning's revelations. Each of our interviews had raised more questions than they had answered. The various accounts of the previous evening's events, while not contradictory, seemed to contain carefully constructed gaps as if each speaker was editing their memories. Before sharing them, Poirot appeared lost in thought as we made our way toward his suite. His famous little grey cells were clearly working at full capacity, processing the morning's revelations and filing them away according to some system of logic that remained, as always, opaque to my understanding. The tragic death of Céleste Valois was revealing itself to be considerably more complex than a simple accident, and I found myself wondering what other secrets lay hidden among the elegant guests of the Hotel Splendide. Chapter 3. Secrets in Lavender. Following our enlightening interviews with the hotel guests, Poirot announced his intention to examine Mademoiselle Valois' private quarters more thoroughly. Inspector Giraud had completed his preliminary investigation and, with characteristic Gallic pragmatism, had declared the death an unfortunate accident caused by a weak heart and an unfortunate fall. Poirot's expression upon hearing this pronouncement had been one of polite skepticism. The good inspector, he sees only what is on the surface, he murmured as we made our way through the hotel's elegant corridors toward the deceased singer's suite. But Poirot, he must look deeper. The truth, she hides herself most cleverly sometimes. The Lavender suite occupied a corner of the hotel's second floor, with windows overlooking both the Mediterranean and the hotel's private gardens. As we entered, I was immediately struck by the overwhelming sense of order and refinement that characterized the rooms. Everything was arranged with an almost theatrical precision that spoke of a woman accustomed to public performance extending into her private life. The sitting room was decorated in subtle shades of cream and gold, with fresh lavender sprigs arranged in crystal vases throughout. The famous scent that had so pervaded the death scene was present here as well, but in a more natural, pleasant concentration. A grand piano dominated one corner of the room, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows. "Observe, Hastings," Poirot said, moving slowly through the room with that peculiar cat-like grace he employed when examining a scene. "What does this room tell us about Mademoiselle Valois?" I looked around, noting the expensive furnishings and the obvious care with which everything had been arranged. "She was a woman of considerable means and refined taste," I ventured. "But what else? Look more closely at the details." Following his example, I began to examine the room more carefully. On the piano, sheet music was arranged in neat stacks, but I noticed that some pieces bore notations in different colored inks, as if they had been studied and revised multiple times. A small writing desk near the window held an inkwell, several fountain pens, and what appeared to be correspondence, though the letters were no longer visible. "The writing desk, Poirot," I said. "It looks as though papers have been removed recently." "Precisement. And notice, if you please, the slight discoloration of the leather blotter. Something has been placed there regularly, perhaps a book or journal, but it is no longer present." We moved into the bedroom, which maintained the same elegant simplicity as the sitting room. The wardrobe, when opened, revealed an extensive collection of gowns and costumes, each carefully preserved and arranged. However, I noticed several empty spaces among the hanging garments, as if items had been removed. "She traveled light for someone planning an extended stay," I observed. "Or perhaps," Poirot suggested, "certain items were removed after her arrival. But by whom and for what purpose?" It was in the bedroom's small dressing alcove that we made our most significant discovery. Hidden behind a loose panel in the wainscoting, Poirot's searching fingers located a slim, leather-bound volume. The book was approximately 6 inches square, bound in deep burgundy leather that matched the gown Mademoiselle Valois had been wearing when we found her. "Voilà," Poirot murmured with satisfaction. "The missing journal, I think." Opening the book revealed page after page of writing in a neat, feminine hand. However, as we quickly discovered, the contents were not in any language either of us could readily identify. The text appeared to be written in some form of code or cipher, with letters and symbols arranged in patterns that defied immediate comprehension. "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "What on earth would a celebrated opera singer need with secret codes?" An excellent question, Hastings, and one that suggests how Mademoiselle Valois was perhaps more than she appeared to be. Poirot carefully examined several pages of the mysterious writing. This is not a simple substitution cipher. It shows considerable sophistication in its construction. We were interrupted by a discreet knock at the door. Marie, the hotel maid who had discovered the body, stood in the doorway with obvious nervousness. "Pardon, messieurs," she said in heavily accented English. "I have come to ER to collect the linens for washing." "Of course," Marie Poirot replied kindly, "but perhaps you could spare us a moment. You knew Mademoiselle Valois better than most, I think." The young woman's hands twisted. In her apron she was always very kind to me, monsieur, not like some of the guests who treat the staff as if we were invisible. "Did you notice anything unusual about her behavior in recent days?" Poirot asked, but Marie hesitated, glancing around the room as if afraid of being overheard. She seemed worried. "Monsieur, she would ask me strange questions about the other guests who visited whom, what conversations I might have overheard, and she was always writing in that little book of hers." This book. Poirot showed her the journal we had discovered. Marie's eyes widened. "Oui, monsieur. She carried it with her always, and she would write in it at the strangest times. Sometimes I would find her writing at 3 in the morning, sitting by the window with just a single candle for light." "Did she ever receive any unusual visitors? People who might not have come through the main entrance?" The maid's nervousness increased visibly. There was a man, monsieur. He came twice, maybe 3 times, always very late at night. He did not come through the lobby, but somehow found his way to her private balcony. I saw him only once. From the service corridor, a thin man, very pale, wearing a dark coat. This was intriguing information indeed. "Did Mademoiselle Valois seem pleased or distressed by these visits?" Poirot inquired. "Frightened, I think," Marie replied quietly. "After his visits, she would pace the floor for hours, and she began asking me about the other guests more frequently after his first visit." Poirot thanked the maid, and after she had departed with her bundle of linens, returned his attention to the coded journal. He had settled himself in a comfortable chair by the window, and was studying the mysterious writing with the concentrated intensity he brought to all puzzles. "This is fascinating work, Hastings," he murmured, not looking up from the pages. "See here, the pattern suggests that this is based on musical notation somehow. Note how certain sequences repeat, rather like musical phrases." I peered over his shoulder at the incomprehensible symbols. To my untrained eye, they appeared to be nothing more than an elaborate form of shorthand, but I had learned to trust Poirot's insights in such matters. "If it's musical, perhaps it relates to her professional work," I suggested. Perhaps her professional work provided a convenient cover for other activities." Poirot closed the journal carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "But we must be cautious, mon ami. If Mademoiselle Valois felt the need to hide this journal so carefully, and if she was receiving mysterious midnight visitors, then we are dealing with something considerably more dangerous than a simple accident." As we prepared to leave the suite, I noticed that the overwhelming scent of lavender seemed even more concentrated here than it had in the salon where we found the body. The observation troubled me for reasons I could not quite articulate. Poirot seemed to understand my discomfort. "You are right to be puzzled by the perfume, Hastings. It is too strong, too artificial somehow. Natural lavender does not maintain such intensity in a closed room." He paused at the door, taking one final look around the elegant chambers. "No, there is something very deliberate about that scent. Something that was meant to mask other odors, perhaps, or to draw attention away from other evidence." The afternoon sun was beginning to set over the Mediterranean as we made our way back to Poirot's suite. The mysterious journal secure in his possession, and our minds filled with new questions about the increasingly complex circumstances surrounding Céleste Valois' death. The simple accident that Inspector Giraud had so readily accepted was revealing itself to be something far more sinister, and I found myself wondering what other secrets lay hidden within the elegant walls of the Hotel Splendid. Chapter 4. The German Question. The discovery of Mademoiselle Valois' coded journal had clearly stimulated Poirot's intellectual appetite, and I found him the following morning seated in the hotel's garden pavilion. The mysterious book opened before him, alongside several sheets of paper covered with his neat calculations. The Mediterranean breeze stirred the pages gently as he worked with the concentrated intensity of a master craftsman. "Bonjour, mon ami Hastings," he said without looking up from his work. "At last the little grey cells, they have achieved a breakthrough. The cipher it is not merely based on musical notation, as I first suspected. It is far more clever than that." "You've decoded it completely?" I asked, settling into the chair opposite his makeshift desk. "Partially only. Partially, but enough to understand that Mademoiselle Valois was indeed involved in activities far removed from the opera stage." He tapped his pencil thoughtfully against the journal's leather cover. "However, before we delve deeper into these revelations, I think we must speak again with the Baron von Stelfen. His earlier testimony had contained certain omissions. We found the Baron in his usual morning position on the terrace, though today he appeared less composed than during our previous encounter. His newspaper lay folded and unread beside his coffee cup, and I noticed that his typically immaculate appearance showed signs of a restless night. His collar was slightly askew, and his usually perfectly groomed hair showed traces of having been run through with nervous fingers. "Herr Baron," Poirot began with his customary politeness, "we have learned some additional details about Mademoiselle Valois' final day that we hoped you might clarify for us." The Baron's pale eyes flickered with what might have been alarm. "I have told you everything I know about the poor woman's accident. Indeed, however, the hotel manager informs us that you visited Mademoiselle Valois privately yesterday afternoon, a detail that somehow escaped mention in our previous conversation." I watched as the Baron's hands clenched almost imperceptibly before he regained control of himself. When he spoke, his voice carried a slight tremor that had not been present before. "Yes," he admitted reluctantly, "I did call upon her. It was a matter of old acquaintance, nothing more." "And the nature of this old acquaintance?" Poirot inquired gently. Baron von Stelfen was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the Mediterranean met the sky. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one required careful consideration. "I knew cellist Mademoiselle Valois, Vienna, as I mentioned, but our association was more complex than I initially indicated." He paused, consulting his pocket watch in that nervous habit I had noticed before. "We were both involved in certain cultural exchanges between nations, musical collaborations that sometimes served other purposes." "What sort of other purposes?" I found myself asking, though I suspected I already knew the answer. The Baron's laugh was bitter. "Information, Captain Hastings. In these troubled times, those who travel freely between countries, who are welcomed in the salons of the powerful, sometimes find themselves in possession of knowledge that others value highly." "You are speaking of espionage," Poirot stated matter-of-factly. "I am speaking of survival." The Baron replied sharply. "Do you think a German nobleman can travel freely in Europe today without providing certain assurances of his usefulness, without demonstrating his value to those who might otherwise view him with suspicion?" This revelation cast an entirely new light on our investigation. I found myself studying the Baron with fresh eyes, noting details I had previously dismissed. Way his gaze constantly surveyed the surrounding area, his careful positioning at tables that allowed him clear views of all entrances, and his habit of speaking in lowered tones even when discussing apparently innocent topics, and Mademoiselle Valois' role in these cultural exchanges. Poirot prompted. She was a courier of sorts. Her concert tours provided excellent cover for carrying information between various interested parties. The Baron's voice grew even quieter, but she had grown careless in recent months, too confident, perhaps, or too frightened. She spoke of wanting to withdraw from these activities, and certain parties were reluctant to allow her retirement. The Baron nodded grimly. There were those who felt she knew too much to simply walk away. Her farewell performance was to have been more than symbolic. It was to mark the end of her usefulness in other capacities as well. "The mysterious visitor who came to her balcony," I said suddenly, remembering the maid's testimony. "Was he connected to these activities?" Baron von Stelfen's face went pale. "You know about Heinrich then? You understand the danger we are all in. He was her handler, her contact with certain interested parties. If he was here in Nice, then the situation was far more serious than I realized." "This Heinrich, describe him, please," Poirot requested. "Thin, pale, always dressed in dark clothing. He moves like a shadow, and has the disconcerting habit of appearing without warning. I had hoped never to see him again after Vienna, but if he followed Celeste here—" The Baron left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. "Your visit to Mademoiselle Valois yesterday, was it to warn her of some danger? It was to plead with her to be more careful. There had been incidents involving others who had tried to leave the network. I feared for her safety, but she laughed at my concerns. She said she had taken precautions, that she had insurance against anyone who might wish her harm." "What sort of insurance?" Poirot's voice sharpened with interest. "She would not say only that she had documented everything, and that certain revelations would prove embarrassing to powerful people if anything happened to her." The Baron stood abruptly, his agitation obvious. "But such precautions are meaningless against men like Heinrich. They have ways of making deaths appear accidentally natural. Poor Celeste was naive to think her insurance would protect her." As the Baron prepared to leave us, Poirot posed one final question. "This journal that Mademoiselle Valois kept, would it have contained the sort of documentation she referred to as insurance?" The Baron's face showed genuine alarm. "For the first time. If such a journal exists, Monsieur Poirot, then everyone mentioned in it is in mortal danger. These people do not tolerate loose ends, and they consider exposure to be a form of treason that demands the ultimate penalty." After the Baron's departure, I found myself acutely aware of our surroundings in a way I had not been before. The cheerful Mediterranean setting suddenly seemed less benign, and I caught myself scanning the faces of other hotel guests with new suspicion. "This puts a rather different complexion on things, doesn't it, Poirot?" I said. "If we're dealing with international espionage, it explains much." Poirot agreed, carefully folding his notes and securing them in his jacket pocket. "The sophisticated cipher, the mysterious visitors, the victim's evident fear in her final weeks, yes, it explains much, but it also raises new questions. If Mademoiselle Valois possessed such dangerous information, and if her death was arranged by professionals, then how do we explain the apparently clumsy nature of the crime scene?" "What do you mean?" "The broken perfume bottle, mon ami, the overwhelming scent of lavender. These are not the hallmarks of a professional assassination. They suggest either amateur work or—" He paused thoughtfully. "Or perhaps they are meant to suggest amateur work." As we made our way back toward the hotel, I could not shake the feeling that we were being observed. The Baron's revelations had opened a window into a shadowy world where famous singers carried state secrets and mysterious men crept along balconies in the dead of night. Yet somehow, these dramatic revelations seemed to complicate rather than clarify the central mystery of Celeste Valois' death. The truth, as Poirot so often observed, was proving to be considerably more complex than it first appeared. Chapter 5. Affairs of the Heart. The revelations about Baron von Stauffen's espionage connections had cast a new and sinister light over our investigation, but Poirot remained convinced that we had not yet uncovered the complete truth. As we returned to the hotel that afternoon, he announced his intention to speak once more with Countess Alina Rossetti. "The Countess, she has been most economical with the truth," he observed, adjusting his tie with characteristic precision. "And in matters involving secrets of the heart, women often prove to be the most dangerous adversaries of all." We found the Countess in her private sitting room, a luxuriously appointed space overlooking the hotel's rose gardens. She was seated at a small writing desk, a half-finished letter before her, but I noticed that her pen had remained motionless for some time. Her elegant fingers trembled slightly as she set it aside upon our entrance. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said, rising gracefully despite the obvious strain in her voice. "I confess I have been expecting you. The walls of even the finest hotels have ears, and news travels swiftly in such confined spaces. Then you are aware that we have learned of Mademoiselle Valois' additional activities?" Poirot inquired gently. The Countess moved to the window, her silhouette framed against the golden afternoon light. "If you mean her involvement with certain political interests, then yes, though I suspect you may not yet understand the full complexity of the situation. Perhaps you would enlighten us." Madame. She turned back to face us, and I was struck by the profound sadness that shadowed her aristocratic features. "Celeste, and our relationship was far more intimate than I initially suggested. We were not merely friends, Monsieur Poirot, we were lovers." The simple statement hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. I found myself somewhat embarrassed by such a frank admission, but Poirot merely nodded as if he had long suspected as much. This relationship began in Vienna, he asked. 3 years ago, when she performed at the State Opera, I was there with my husband, a diplomatic visit of sorts. The Countess returned to her chair, her movements carrying the weight of someone bearing a heavy burden. Antonio, my husband, was engaged in discussions with various Austrian officials about mining, concessions, tedious business affairs that required endless social obligations. But you found Mademoiselle Valois's company more stimulating. A ghost of a smile crossed the Countess's lips. She was magnificent, Monsieur Poirot. Not merely her voice, though. That was heaven itself, but her mind, her passion for life, her courage. She was everything I was not permitted to be in my own existence, and your husband was unaware of this attachment. Antonio sees only what serves his business interests. As long as I fulfilled my social obligations and maintained the proper appearances, he cared little for my private friendships. Her voice carried a note of bitterness, though recently that began to change. How so, madame? The Countess hesitated, her hands clasping and unclasping in her lap. Someone had been sending him anonymous letters, suggestions that his wife's behavior was becoming the subject of speculation in certain circles. Nothing explicit, you understand, but sufficiently clear to arouse his suspicions. Blackmail, I said, understanding immediately. Of a sort, yes, though no money was demanded. The letters seemed designed purely to create discord, to threaten the discretion that had protected us both. She stood again, pacing to the mantelpiece where a collection of silver-framed photographs displayed various social occasions. Celeste was convinced that someone was attempting to manipulate us both. Did she suspect who might be responsible? Poirot asked. She had theories, but would not share them with me. She said, the less I knew, the safer I would be. The Countess picked up one of the photographs, a formal portrait of herself and a distinguished-looking gentleman I assumed to be her husband. But she was frightened, Monsieur Poirot, more frightened than I had ever seen her. The silk scarf that was found in an unexpected location, Poirot said suddenly. Was it yours, madame? The Countess's composure faltered completely. How did you? Yes, it was mine, she admitted. A favorite of Celeste's, she said. The color reminded her of twilight over the Adriatic. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I had left it in her room some days ago, but it was discovered in the corridor outside the Baron's suite. Can you explain how it came to be there? I retrieved it yesterday evening after visiting Celeste to wish her well for the performance. The Countess's hands were shaking now. I knew it would be our final meeting. Once she retired from public life, she planned to disappear entirely for both our sakes. You visited her before the performance? Yes, but she was different, agitated in a way I had never seen. She kept checking the time, glancing toward the windows as if expecting someone. She gave me back the scarf and several other small gifts I had given her over the years. She said it was safer if I had no mementos that could connect us. What time did you leave her? Perhaps 7. I intended to return to my room to prepare for the evening's performance, but she paused, her breathing becoming irregular. But I encountered Baron von Stauffen in the corridor. He seemed equally agitated, and when I dropped the scarf, he helped me retrieve it. We spoke briefly about Celeste's strange behavior. What did the Baron say? That she was in grave danger, and that I should stay away from her. He said there were people watching, the hotel people, who would not hesitate to harm anyone they perceived as a threat. The Countess sank back into her chair. I thought he was being overly dramatic, but now, now, you believe his warnings were justified. The way she died, Monsieur Poirot, was too convenient, too perfectly timed. Celeste was many things, but she was not careless with her health or her person. She would never have taken medication carelessly or allowed herself to become so overwrought as to suffer an accidental poisoning. You believe she was murdered? The Countess met his gaze directly. I believe someone wanted her silenced before she could retire from her other activities. But I also believe that person underestimated Celeste's preparations for such a contingency. The insurance policy the Baron mentioned. She showed me a small portion of what she had compiled: names, dates, locations of meetings, coded references to information that had been passed along, enough to destroy several powerful men if it ever became public. The Countess's voice grew stronger. She said she had hidden copies in multiple locations, with instructions for their release if anything happened to her. Do you know where these documents might be hidden? she would not tell me, but she did say that the answer lay in something only I would understand, a reference to our first meeting, our first conversation about her art. The Countess looked puzzled. She spoke of the aria that made her weep, but I confess I cannot recall which specific piece she meant. As we prepared to take our leave, I noticed that the Countess had begun the unconscious action of shredding the letter she had been writing when we arrived. The pieces fell like snow onto the polished surface of her writing desk. "One final question," Madame Poirot said gently. "The perfume bottle that was broken in Mademoiselle Valois's salon. Had you ever seen it before?" "Oh yes," she replied without hesitation. "It was her signature scent, created especially for her by a parfumier in Grasse. But the bottle in her room was not the original one." "How can you be certain?" "Because the original was made of Bohemian crystal with a distinctive cut pattern. The one I saw broken on the floor was common glass, quite obviously a substitution." Her eyes filled with tears. Someone had replaced even that small, precious thing with a cheap imitation. As we walked back through the hotel's elegant corridors, I found myself deeply moved by the Countess's obvious grief and equally impressed by her courage in sharing such intimate details. The picture of Céleste Valois was becoming increasingly complex, a woman caught between worlds, between loves, between dangerous loyalties that ultimately cost her everything. Yet beneath the tragedy, I sensed that Poirot was beginning to perceive a pattern, a logic to events that remained invisible to my less practiced eye. Chapter 6. The Understudy's Gambit. The morning following our illuminating conversation with Countess Rossetti found Poirot in an unusually contemplative mood. He had spent considerable time the previous evening studying Celeste's coded journal, and I noticed several additional sheets of paper covered with his careful notations scattered across his desk. "The cipher, it begins to yield its secrets," he announced as I joined him for breakfast. "But what it reveals, mon ami, is most disturbing indeed. Mademoiselle Valois was not merely a courier, she was maintaining detailed records of a network that extends far beyond what we initially imagined." "Have you identified the people mentioned in the journal?" I asked. "Some, yes, but others remain mysterious. There are references to L'Ombre, the Shadow, and La Rossignol, the Nightingale. Codenames, clearly, but for whom?" He tapped his fountain pen thoughtfully against the journal's cover. "However, there is one name that appears frequently in plain text, Marguerite." This observation prompted our decision to interview the understudy once more. We found Marguerite Dubois in the hotel's small theatre space, a converted salon, where Madame Céleste Valois had been scheduled to give her farewell performance. The young woman was seated at the piano, her fingers moving silently over the keys as she read through a complex musical score. "Mademoiselle Dubois," Poirot said gently, his voice carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect space. "We hope we are not intruding upon your rehearsal." She looked up, and I was struck by how much older she appeared than during our previous encounter. The events of the past few days seemed to have aged her considerably, adding lines of worry around her eyes, and attention to her posture that spoke of sleepless nights. "I was not rehearsing, Monsieur Poirot," she replied quietly. "I was simply remembering. Céleste taught me this piece, and I wanted to hear it once more as she would have played it. The piece has special significance. It was the first aria she ever performed professionally, au mieux, Babino Caro from Puccini's Johnny Schicchi," she said. "It represented the moment she knew she was truly an artist, not merely someone who could carry a tune." Marguerite's fingers traced the notes on the page with obvious reverence. She called it the aria that made her weep. I saw Poirot's eyes sharpen with interest at this phrase, the same one Countess Rossetti had mentioned as holding special significance for Céleste. "You were very close to Mademoiselle Valois?" Poirot inquired. "She was like a mother to me," Marguerite replied, her voice thick with emotion. "When I first came to Nice 3 years ago, I was nobody, a provincial girl with dreams too large for her circumstances. Céleste took me under her wing, taught me not just music, but how to survive in a world that can be very cruel to young women with artistic ambitions." "Survive in what way, mademoiselle?" Marguerite hesitated, glancing around the empty theatre as if afraid of being overheard. "There are men in this business, Monsieur Poirot, who believe that a woman's artistic talents are secondary to other services she might provide. Céleste showed me how to avoid such entanglements, how to protect myself while still advancing my career." "And did she also teach you about her other activities, the ones unrelated to music?" The young woman's face went pale. I don't know what you mean. Come, mademoiselle. We have learned about the network, about the information being passed between various parties. Your name appears frequently in Mademoiselle Valois' private records. Marguerite stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the hotel's gardens. For a long moment, she remained silent, her shoulders rigid with some internal struggle. She tried to keep me out of it, she finally said, but I insisted on helping. I was young and foolish and thought it was all very romantic-like, something from an adventure novel. What exactly did you do to help? Small things, mostly. I would carry messages sometimes, or I would create distractions during social gatherings. While Celeste had private conversations with certain guests, I thought I was helping the cause of freedom, of democracy. Her laugh was bitter. I was such a naive child. But recently, your role had changed. Celeste became frightened. She said the network was becoming too dangerous, too violent. People were disappearing or dying in convenient accidents. She wanted to leave, but they wouldn't let her. Marguerite turned back to face us, so she began making plans. What sort of plans? She was documenting everything, every meeting, every piece of information passed, every person involved. She said it was her insurance policy, but I think it was also her way of cleansing her conscience. Marguerite's hands twisted together. Nervously, she asked me to help her create multiple copies of certain documents and to hide them in various locations. Do you know where these documents are hidden? Some of them, yes, but Celeste was careful never to let any one person know all the locations. She said it was safer that way. Marguerite moved to a music stand near the piano and carefully lifted the top several sheets of music. Beneath them was a manila envelope, sealed with red wax. This is one of the copies. She asked me to keep it safe and to give it to someone trustworthy if anything happened to her. Poirot accepted the envelope with evident satisfaction. Most wise of you to preserve it, mademoiselle, and most wise of Mademoiselle Valois to choose her allies so carefully. There's something else, Marguerite said quietly. The night she died, I was supposed to meet with her after her final preparations for the performance. We had arranged a signal if she felt it was safe to proceed with our planned revelations. She would leave her dressing room door slightly ajar. If there was danger, she would lock it and leave a particular piece of sheet music on her music stand. And which signal did you find? Neither, Marguerite replied, her voice barely above a whisper. When I arrived at the appointed time, the door was closed but not locked, and there was no music on the stand at all. It was as if she had been interrupted before she could give any signal. What time was this? Shortly after 8. I waited in the corridor for several minutes, but when she didn't appear, I assumed she had been delayed by other visitors. Marguerite's eyes filled with tears. If I had investigated immediately, if I had knocked on the door, you would most likely have become another victim, Poirot said firmly. The person responsible for Mademoiselle Valois' death was clearly prepared for contingencies. As we examined the envelope Marguerite had given us, I noticed that it bore no markings except for a small musical notation. Drawn in the corner a few notes that I couldn't identify, but which seemed somehow familiar. This musical notation, I said, pointing to the corner of the envelope. Do you recognize it? Marguerite nodded. It's from O mio babbino caro, the opening phrase of the aria I was just playing. Celeste used it as a sort of signature on documents she considered particularly important. The same aria the Countess mentioned, I murmured to Poirot. Precisement, mon ami. The pieces of the puzzle, they begin to form a pattern. Poirot carefully secured the envelope in his jacket pocket. Mademoiselle Dubois, you have been most helpful, but I must ask you to be extremely careful in the coming days. If the person responsible for Mademoiselle Valois' death learns of your cooperation with us, I understand, she replied quietly, but I owe it to Celeste to see that justice is done. She saved me from a life of compromise and degradation. The least I can do is help expose the truth about her death. As we prepared to leave the theatre, I noticed that Marguerite had returned to the piano and was once again playing the opening measures of Puccini's aria. The melody followed us as we walked back through the hotel's corridors, its haunting beauty a fitting tribute to a woman whose own final performance had been cut tragically short. Yet beneath the sadness of the music, I sensed a growing momentum in our investigation, as if all the scattered pieces of evidence were finally beginning to coalesce into a coherent pattern that even I might eventually understand. Chapter 7, Cipher and Smoke. With the additional documents from Marguerite Dubois, Poirot had spent the better part of the afternoon in intense concentration. cross-referencing the new material with Celeste's coded journal. I found him in his suite as the sun began to set over the Mediterranean, surrounded by papers and looking remarkably pleased with himself. "Ah, mon ami," he said, looking up as I entered. "At last the little grey cells, they have achieved a breakthrough. The cipher it is not merely based on musical notation, as I first suspected. It is far more clever than that." "You've decoded it completely?" I asked, settling into the chair opposite his makeshift desk. May we say the key was understanding that Mademoiselle Valois was not simply substituting musical notes for letters. She was using the harmonic progressions of specific arias to create her encoding system. Each entry corresponds to a different operatic piece, and within that framework, the individual notes represent letters based on their position in the harmonic sequence. "Remarkable," I said, though I confess the technical details were beyond my comprehension. "And what has it revealed?" Poirot's expression grew grave. "A network far more extensive than we imagined, industrial secrets, diplomatic communications, even military intelligence, all flowing through what appeared to be innocent cultural exchanges. But more importantly, it reveals who was coordinating these activities from this very hotel." Before he could elaborate, there was a soft knock at the door. Marie, the hotel maid, stood in the corridor, looking considerably more nervous than during our previous encounter. "Pardon, messieurs," she said quietly, "but I must speak with you. There are things I did not tell you before, because I was frightened. Of course, Marie, please come in and make yourself comfortable." The young woman perched nervously on the edge of a chair, her hands twisting in her apron. "After we spoke yesterday, I remembered something about the night Madame Valois died, something that did not seem important then but now." "Yes," Poirot encouraged gently. "I saw the thin man Heinrich that night. He came to her balcony as usual, but this time was different. Usually he stayed for perhaps 20 minutes, but that evening he left after only a few minutes. And he was carrying something when he left." "What sort of something?" "A small case, like a doctor's bag, black leather, very expensive looking. I had never seen him carry anything before. Usually his hands were always empty." This revelation caused Poirot to lean forward with obvious interest. "And what time was this?" "Perhaps 7:30, maybe 8. I was turning down the beds in the neighboring suite when I saw him leave through the garden." "Did you see anyone else near Madame Valois' rooms that evening?" Marie hesitated, her face showing the strain of some internal conflict. There was another person. Someone I was not supposed to see, I think, who Madame Armitage. She came up the service stairs, very unusual for a guest of her. Standing, she seemed to know exactly where she was going, and she carried a small package wrapped in brown paper." "What time was this?" "Ah, later perhaps, 9, maybe a few minutes after. I was collecting the evening's laundry when I saw her in the corridor outside Mademoiselle Valois' suite. She knocked very softly, and when there was no answer, she used a key." "She had a key to Mademoiselle Valois' rooms," I exclaimed. "It appeared," Marie said. "She entered very quietly and remained inside for perhaps 10 minutes. When she emerged, she no longer carried the package." After Marie had departed, Poirot immediately began making preparations to leave the hotel. "Come, Hastings, we must make a journey to Grasse, the perfumery that created Mademoiselle Valois' signature scent. I suspect we will find answers there." The drive to Grasse through the winding mountain roads provided an opportunity for Poirot to share his developing theories about the case. The coded journal, he explained, had revealed that Mrs. Armitage was far more than a collector of musical memorabilia. "She is l'ombre, the shadow," he said, as our taxi navigated the steep curves, "the coordinator of the entire network. Her collecting expeditions provided perfect cover for traveling throughout Europe, meeting with various contacts and arranging for the transfer of sensitive information. And her husband, a convenient front. I suspect his business interests provided legitimate reasons for travel and for maintaining contacts with industrialists and government officials throughout Europe." We reached Grasse as the last light was fading from the sky. The perfumery that had created Celeste's signature lavender blend was a small, family-owned establishment tucked away in one of the town's narrow medieval streets. The elderly proprietor, Monsieur Beaumont, received us with the courteous skepticism typical of artisans, whose work serves the wealthy and famous. "Ah, yes, I remember Mademoiselle Valois very well," he said when Poirot explained our mission. "Such a discerning client. She understood that perfume is not merely scent, but memory, emotion, identity itself. The blend you created for her, was it unique? Poirot asked. Absolument. I created it specifically for her based on her own specifications. She wanted something that would remind her of her childhood in Provence wild lavender, a touch of rosemary, and a very subtle bass note of vanilla. And the bottles are the bottles. She was most particular about the moldy Bohemian crystal, cut in a specific pattern that caught the light just so. She said the bottle was as important as the perfume itself. Have you created this blend for anyone else? Monsieur Beaumont shook his head emphatically. Never. It was her signature, her exclusive creation. Though he paused, looking troubled. Yes, there was a woman who came here perhaps 2 weeks ago. She brought a sample of the perfume and asked me to create something similar but in a different concentration. She claimed to be Mademoiselle Valois' assistant, but something about her manner seemed incorrect. Can you describe this woman? Middle-aged, well-dressed, with very sharp eyes. She spoke French with an English accent and was most insistent that I create the blend immediately. She also requested that I use common glass bottles rather than crystal. Did you fulfill her request? I created a similar blend, but I was not comfortable with the deception. The concentration she requested was much stronger than the original, almost overwhelming in its intensity, and when I questioned the need for such potency, she became quite agitated. As we drove back to Nice through the darkened countryside, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a coherent picture in my mind. The substitute perfume bottle, the unnaturally strong scent in the death room, Mrs. Armitage's mysterious visit with the package, all pointed toward a carefully orchestrated plan. She killed her, I said suddenly. Mrs. Armitage killed Céleste Valois. The evidence certainly suggests it, Poirot agreed. But we must still determine exactly how the crime was accomplished. More importantly, why Mrs. Armitage chose to eliminate someone who was clearly a valuable asset to her network. Perhaps Céleste had become too dangerous to keep alive. Perhaps there was something more personal at stake. Poirot stared out at the lights of Nice as they came into view below us. Tomorrow, mon ami, we will gather all our suspects together and reveal the truth. But tonight, I must ensure that we have identified all the components of this most cleverly constructed crime. The Hotel Splendid seemed different as we returned, no longer the elegant refuge I had first encountered, but rather a stage set where a deadly drama had been performed with consummate skill. Yet I sensed that the final act was yet to come, and that Poirot's famous little grey cells had already written the script for tomorrow's dramatic conclusion. Chapter 8. The final performance. The Grand Salon of the Hotel Splendid had been transformed for what Poirot announced would be his final examination of the case. The evening light streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the assembled guests, each of whom had found compelling reasons to attend what they believed would be a routine summary of the investigation's findings. I took my customary position near the marble fireplace, from where I could observe both Poirot and the reactions of our assembled suspects. Baron von Stauffen sat rigidly upright in a Louis XVI chair, his military bearing unchanged despite the revelations of recent days. Countess Rossetti had chosen a position near the windows, her elegant black dress making her appear like a figure from a painting of noble grief. Marguerite Dubois perched nervously on the edge of a settee, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Mr. and Mrs. Armitage occupied prominent chairs in the center of the room, their expressions ranging from polite interest to barely concealed impatience. Madame et Messieurs, Poirot began, his hands clasped behind his back as he stood before the assembled company. We are gathered here this evening to discuss the tragic death of Mademoiselle Céleste Valois. What appeared to be a simple accident has revealed itself to be something far more complex, a crime of extraordinary calculation and cold-blooded precision. Really, Monsieur Poirot, Mrs. Armitage interjected with sharp irritation. Surely Inspector Giraud's investigation was thorough enough. The poor woman clearly suffered some sort of attack and accidentally broke a perfume bottle in her distress. Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, Madame Poirot replied smoothly. The perfume bottle was not accidentally broken, it was deliberately shattered to create the overwhelming scent that would mask another odor, specifically the scent of almonds that accompanies cyanide poisoning. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. I saw Baron von Stauffen's face go pale while Marguerite's hand flew to her throat in obvious shock. Cyanide, the Countess whispered. But how is that possible? There was no evidence of because the poison was not administered in the traditional manner. Poirot continued. It was delivered through the one medium that Mademoiselle Valois would never have suspected, her beloved lavender perfume. The killer created a substitute blend, identical in appearance but containing a fatal concentration of hydrogen cyanide dissolved in the alcohol base. But that's impossible, Mr. Armitage protested. Cyanide has a distinctive odor. Surely she would have noticed it. Not if the perfume was sufficiently concentrated with lavender essence to mask the bitter almond scent. Our visit to the perfumery in Grasse confirmed that such a blend was created specifically for this purpose. Poirot's piercing gaze swept across the assembled faces. The killer arranged for this substitute bottle to be placed in Mademoiselle Valois' salon, replacing her genuine Bohemian crystal bottle with a common glass imitation filled with liquid death. This is all very dramatic, Mrs. Armitage said coldly. But surely you have some evidence to support these wild theories. Indeed, I do, madame. Let us examine the events of that fatal evening in chronological order. Poirot began to pace slowly before his audience. At approximately 7:30, Heinrich, the mysterious handler from the espionage network, made his final visit to Mademoiselle Valois. This visit was brief and ended with his departure carrying a black medical bag. I believe this bag contained the original perfume bottle, which he removed as part of the murder plan. Baron von Stauffen shifted uncomfortably in his chair. You're suggesting Heinrich was the killer? On the contrary, Herr Baron Heinrich was merely following orders from his superior in the networks, someone who had decided that Mademoiselle Valois had become too dangerous to live. Someone who had access to her rooms, knowledge of her habits, and the ruthless determination to eliminate a perceived threat. At 9 o'clock, Poirot continued, our killer made a final visit to complete the murder, using a key obtained through careful planning. This person entered Mademoiselle Valois' salon and discovered that the victim had already used the poisoned perfume, finding her collapsed at her vanity table. The killer then staged the scene to appear accidental, shattering the substitute bottle to create the overwhelming lavender scent that would confuse investigators and mask any residual odor of cyanide. The silk scarf, Countess Rossetti said suddenly. How does that fit into your theory? An excellent question, madame. The scarf was dropped by accident during the killer's hasty departure. When it was discovered near Baron von Staufen's suite, it was meant to provide an additional red herring, suggesting either the Baron's involvement or your own presence in areas where you should not have been. Mrs. Armitage stood abruptly, her face flushed with indignation. This is absolute nonsense. You have no proof of any of this wild speculation. Theodore, please remain seated. Madame, Poirot said firmly, we are not yet finished. You see, the killer made 3 crucial errors. First, the substitution of common glass for Bohemian crystallia, detail that would matter only to someone who knew Mademoiselle Valois intimately. Second, the timing of the bottle's breakage, which occurred after death rather than before, as evidenced by the pattern of glass fragments. And third, the presence of lavender pollen on the killer's clothing. Lavender pollen? I asked, fascinated despite the grim circumstances. Mais oui, Hastings. The concentrated perfume blend contained fresh lavender essence, which naturally includes pollen particles. These microscopic particles would adhere to clothing and remain detectable for several days. A simple examination of our suspect's garments would reveal enough. Mrs. Armitage's composure finally cracked completely. You self-important little man. Do you think you understand the forces at work here? Céleste Valois was a traitor who threatened the security of nations. She had to be stopped. The room erupted in shocked exclamations, but Poirot raised his hand for silence. So you admit to the murder, madame? I admit to eliminating a threat to vital interests, she replied defiantly. Céleste had grown weak, sentimental. She was planning to expose the entire network to destroy years of careful work that served the cause of democracy and freedom. The cause of profit, more likely, Baron von Stauffen said quietly. Industrial espionage disguised as patriotism. You know nothing, Mrs. Armitage snarled. The information we gathered prevented wars, saved lives, maintained the balance of power that keeps Europe from tearing itself apart, and made you and your associates extraordinarily wealthy in the process, Poirot observed. Mademoiselle Valois discovered that the network was being used for personal enrichment rather than national security. Her journal documents the sale of stolen industrial processes, the manipulation of diplomatic negotiations for commercial advantage, and the systematic betrayal of trust by those claiming to serve higher purposes. Mrs. Armitage's husband had remained silent throughout these revelations, but now he spoke in a voice heavy with resignation. "Vivian, please, it's over." "It's never over, Theodore," she replied viciously. "There are others who will continue the work. Celeste's death was necessary just as yours will be if you prove unable to maintain your discretion." At this implicit threat, Inspector Giraud and two uniformed officers who had been positioned discreetly near the salon's entrances moved forward to restrain Mrs. Armitage. She struggled briefly, her civilized mask completely fallen away to reveal the calculating killer beneath. As the authorities led her away, the remaining guests sat in stunned silence, each apparently contemplating how completely they had misjudged the woman who had moved among them with such apparent respectability. The elegant salon, which had witnessed so many refined social gatherings, now bore the weight of revealed secrets and the memory of calculated murder. Poirot settled himself wearily into a chair, the dramatic conclusion of the case having clearly taken its toll on his usually inexhaustible energy. The lavender scent that had characterized this entire tragic affair seemed finally to be dissipating, replaced by the fresh evening air flowing through the opened windows. Justice had been served, but at the cost of revealing how easily evil could disguise itself in the refined trappings of civilization. Thanks for joining us for Murder in the Lavender Salon. Did you suspect Mrs. Armitage before Poirot revealed her role as the shadow coordinator? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this adventure with Hercule Poirot, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Poirot's wisdom. The little grey cells reveal that the most civilized settings can harbor the darkest secrets, and that evil often wears the mask of respectability until the final curtain falls. This is Alie, signing off from Café Tales.